Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're working through the redemption arc of Peter. We don't get that redemption arc explicitly spelled out in the book of Matthew. If you look close, it's hinted at. You can do the math. Like, well, obviously Peter's there. It seems like Peter and his fate at the end of things is juxtaposed. It's lined up right next to an achronological description of the fate of Judas to make a theological point that we talked about a few days ago. But the rest of the New Testament rounds out that redemption arc, that restoration arc for Peter much more. Last time around, we looked at how the mere existence of the book of Mark, which is the very next thing that happens after the book of Matthew, how that demonstrates the redemption arc of Peter. And we also looked at the end of Luke and how enthusiastic the historian Luke is to be like, nah, like this is how Peter responded. Here's a detail that we don't get from Matthew, but it's a very important detail for the readers who are reading it now to make sense of how things are. And in that same vein, we get really interesting stuff at the end of John. So here's the thing about John that you may or may not know. It is sort of the oddball gospel. The details that John emphasizes, the side jaunts and side quests of John take us to some really different places than we go just even geographically in the first three Gospels, which are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels, syn, same, optics, I, because they take a similar chronological editorial approach. John does other stuff, and one of the big points of emphasis for John is the way his book is structured around these 7 I am statements. I am, like the name of God in the Old Testament. And we've talked before about how Jesus never really has his I am Tony Stark, brash, arrogant, braggadocious moment to declare that he's the thing and y'all better get in line. No, Jesus instead is much more content 3 times in Matthew to say, hey, you've said it so, or well, 2 times in Matthew to say that. He also says it to Judas, which isn't necessarily a proclamation of his messiahship, but yeah, you're tracking. Demons say Jesus is the Christ. Peter says Jesus is the Christ. The people who are going to crucify him, both politically and religiously, say Jesus is the Christ. It's all over the place, but Jesus doesn't chest thump about it in Matthew. John handles it a little bit differently for a little bit different audience. And he has Jesus claiming his divinity, claiming to be the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, specifically the God in the flesh, by making an opening statement in John 1 using pretty Greek philosophical language that says, yeah, Jesus is not just the Jewish idea of the Messiah, but like Jesus is the whole Mediterranean, the whole world philosophical notion of the thin spot between God and man, the mediator. If there is an idea of God in the flesh that is beyond Jewish thought, John is tapping into it at the beginning of John, and then he punctuates that and affirms that through 7 I am statements. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Other statements like that. We'll break all of that down maybe another time. So there's your background on John. Well, you get to the end of John, and it feels like there's an odd relationship between John 20 and John 21. There's some curious repetition, not any kind of contradiction, but it almost reads like John came back after he had written the first 20-chapter version of John, and it had circulated, and people still had a few questions that they needed to connect the dots between what happened with Jesus and his disciples and his death and his resurrection and all of that, and with what things were like now as they're reading it, maybe even much later, because John lived for a really long time. He's the only disciple who didn't die violently. He lived out his days. I mean, he ran into trouble, but he lived out his days in sort of an exile kind of status on a Greek island called Patmos. And so it's possible that John is a much later document because he was such a young kid when he was a disciple and he lived so long. It's also possible that maybe John was mostly written at an earlier time in John's life, but then 21 needed to happen, still, according to Christians and the church, under the inspiration of God, still accurate, still reliable, but maybe as an addendum to answer a question that was floating around. I don't know. Other people have a lot of different theories about why chapter 20 and 21 of John feel like they have a curious relationship And I'm just throwing out one possible theory to explain that. Part of the reason, though, that it feels that way is because twice John feels like it's ending. Like, okay, well, that's it. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which aren't recorded in this book, but they're written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Feels like the end, right? And I mean, it's incredibly powerful and incredibly clarifying. He just said at the end of his book, this was the point of what you just read. This is what I hope it does to you. This is what I hope happens. But then you keep going after that, and there's a whole other chapter. It felt like we were done. And then you get to the end of chapter 21, and it feels like we just sort of do it again. It concludes this way. This is the way the whole book of John concludes. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. The end. Like I added the end part. It doesn't say that, but all of that stuff about not enough books in the world to write down all the stuff Jesus did. That's in there. So it is curious, right? You see it? You can feel that this is at least a valid question. And so it raises the question in the minds of people who think about stuff like this. What gives? Why would John come back and do more? Or people who don't think that John wrote this, who still believe in God and think the Bible is good and important, but are skeptical of the attributed authorship. And they'd say, no, this is written a little bit later after the fact. Somebody playing as John wrote this one, or somebody later just put John's name on there to make it sound more credible. I think there are problems with that position, but some people think that. But even for that person, maybe they would look at it and say, well, the conundrum is, why did somebody later, who knows who, feel the need to come in and tag on this extra bit of Bible here in chapter 21? And to me, I think the answer to the question is going to be found in what's in the text. I mean, what is in chapter 21 that we didn't already have? Well, in chapter 19, we got the execution of Jesus and the burial. And the beginning of 20, we get the resurrection. And Peter factors into that account more than he does in Matthew's account. And it sounds like John got in a foot race with Peter. And John got there first and was all excited. And then Peter got there and he was super excited as well. And then maybe a little bit achronologically, we get some of the details about Jesus appearing to some of the women. And then the disciples are all huddled up, hiding from the people who killed Jesus, thinking they're maybe going to kill them too. And then Jesus shows up and he just starts talking. And Thomas is like, what? Nope, I would have to actually touch those wounds. And Jesus is like, all right, go for it. And then Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus says, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. And then Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples. And maybe that would be the end. But then in 21, we get a bunch of stuff about Peter and Jesus saying all of this stuff and having a conversation with him. And it looks like Peter and Jesus are hanging out and they're eating fish together. And you get kind of a repetition of one of these fishing miracles that seems to sort of round out the idea of I'll make you fishers of men, the initial commissioning that we looked at all the way back in Matthew chapter 4. And then when they finish eating a bunch of those fish, Jesus says to Simon Peter in John 21, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you, which is kind of tough, right? Because Peter's boasted other very big things. So kind of in reverse repetition form, looks like Jesus is going to, there's one shot at undenying him. Then Jesus comes back with a second shot at undenying him. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And then Jesus said, well, take care of my sheep. Okay, so now that's like, there's chance number 2 to undeny him. And now here comes chance number 3 to undeny him. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death that Peter would die. And it's about the crucifixion. And you get a little bit more, but we got enough there to, I think, land the plane on the point. It is possible that John 21 is there because some people maybe read Matthew and they didn't have all of the Gospels yet, and they were unclear on what you're supposed to. Well, last we saw, Peter was crying and upset, and he was out, kind of like Judas, but not quite as bad. Maybe part of what John wanted to accomplish with this gospel was to affirm his very zealous friend and the leadership role that he took, and to make sure that people understood that, Peter knew that he was going to get crucified and die in a way that smacked of things that rhymed historically with things that look like the way Jesus died. Maybe John really wanted to flesh that out. Maybe John's just doing something here in a literary way that I just haven't had enough time to think about yet, and we don't really get a false ending at the end of 20 and then some reiteration in 21 that is after the fact. Maybe this is the way John meant it to be from the very, very beginning, and it accomplishes exactly what he wants to, and I just haven't deep dived as much into John as I have into Matthew, and so you're talking to someone who doesn't totally know what they're talking about, and I just don't get it. Either way, what we see is Peter's story arc being fleshed out all the more through the existence of Mark, through what Luke says about him, writing after the fact by gathering eyewitness accounts, what Luke says about him and his behavior after the crucifixion and after the resurrection, and so much more so, we see that redemption story arc, that restoration of the continued full faith and promise that Jesus is putting in Peter from all the way back in Matthew 16. We see that it's still there, and it's super on display in John 21. And then you get done with John, the fourth of the Gospels, that leaves us with Peter really being affirmed. And then we go into the book of Acts, written by Luke, which opens with Peter seeming to be the guy who is leading the apostles now that Jesus is gone. Thanks for hanging out with me. And as always, thanks for being up for these little detours. The detours, I think, are so important because it allows us to let the main story, that is the story of the life and works and death and resurrection of Jesus, the main story of the Bible is served for us as a springboard into all kinds of other parts of the Bible so that it all fits somewhere. And so the story is as cohesive as we can make it, and so that we can go and track down what might seem to some like critical questions, but that I just think are honest questions that a fair-minded person is probably going to ask when they read the text. So I'm always grateful for your willingness to trot with me down those rabbit holes. I have fun. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.